Hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Please let me know if you can't. This is Michael Simonson, of course, here at Leo Baeck Institute. And I wanted to welcome everyone today to our next discussion. It is the book Panorama by H.G. Adler. I think in the overall picture, this is a lesser known work about the Holocaust, written by a survivor, written quite early in published in 1948. So, among other things, we can also discuss about how the Holocaust has been written about and talked about and how it's changed over time. We have a special guest with us today, Peter Filkins. Thank you for joining us, Peter. Peter is an American poet and a literary translator, and he has done a lot of work translating H.G. Adler into English. Filkins graduated from Williams College with a Bachelor of Arts and from Columbia University with a Master of Fine Arts degree. He has a number of poetry collections. They include the forthcoming Water Music, as well as The View We're Granted. He's co-winner of the 2013 Sheila Motton Best Book Award from the New England Poetry Club. He's been published in the New Republic, Partisan Review, the New Criterion, and the Yale Review. So to go to his work about German literature, he's translated several books of post-war German literature. His translation of Ingeborg Bachmann's collected poems, Songs in Flight, received an Outstanding Translation Award in 1995 from the American Literary Translators Association and was reissued in an expanded second edition titled Darkness Spoken, which also received awards. Filkins was the first to translate H.G. Adler's novels into English. The Journey, Panorama, and The Wall are the three novels he's translated. They were all written soon after the war, but not published, and only in German, till 1962, 1968, and 1988, respectively. Filkins' translation of Panorama, and I assume we are all reading that, if we're all reading English anyway, was listed as one of the best books of 2011 in the New Republic. And he's also written a biography, H.G. Adler, A Life in Many Words, which was published in 2019. He has also translated and published Theresienstadt, 1941 to 1945, The Tale of a Coerced Community, written by H.G. Adler, which is more a comprehensive look at the history of the ghetto. So, Peter, I wanted to welcome you today, and I will turn it over to you to begin the opening presentation, and then we'll begin the discussion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And thanks to the Leo Baeck Institute for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for reading Panorama and being here for discussion about it. I have to give a couple quick corrections. I didn't translate the Theresienstadt book. That was translated by my friend Belinda Cooper.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I see that now. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I just want to make sure. And it is available in paperback from Cambridge University Press now. It's just been released in paperback, therefore much more affordable. And then just as a small matter, Adler's Panorama was completed in 1948, but was not published until 1968. It took 20 years to find a publisher for it. And that was pretty much the fate of Adler's career as a novelist. He wrote 7 novels in the 1950s, and 6 novels in the 1950s, 1 in the 1960s. 3 of the 1950 novels were published, though one of them not until a year after he had died, so he never knew it was going to appear. And the 1960s novel called Hausordnung, or House Rules, was also published in 1969, I believe it was. So Adler had a very checkered career as a writer. His first book is the Theresienstadt book, Theresienstadt 1941-1945, The Face of a Coerced Community. It was one of the first Holocaust studies books ever published, and certainly the most thorough study of Theresienstadt published at the time and really to date. It is encyclopedic in its knowledge of and accounting of Adler's experience in Theresienstadt, though it is not a memoir. It is a sociological study of Theresienstadt. In fact, Adler appears very hardly at all in the book. He mainly appears in a footnote at the back of the book, which traces his experience and history in Theresienstadt and that of his wife. But to talk about him and Panorama, what I thought I'd do today, since he's not that well known, is to give you a bit of background on him and his life and a kind of thumbnail sketch. And then we can open it up for a Q&A about Panorama or Adler's works or Adler himself. So can everybody see my screen? Michael's, yes, this is visible to everyone? Yes, good, great. So this is a portrait of H.G. Adler, 1928. He's born in 1910, so he's 18 years old here. Rather dapper looking. He was described as a dandy as a young man. He sort of was a man about town, loved to go to concerts, loved to go to literary events. HG stands for Hans Gunther. And once Adler was deported to Theresienstadt in 1942, he refused ever to use the names Hans Gunther again and never published under the names Hans Gunther, mainly because Hans Gunther was Eichmann's henchman and in charge of the deportation of Czechoslovakian Jews. So he refused to use that name ever again. To his family and friends, he was known as Gunther throughout his life. Born in 1910 to a secularized Jewish family in Prague, his father ran a book bindery, and a stationery store. His mother aspired to be a doctor, but women, of course, were not allowed to at the time. Instead, she's trained as a physical therapist and a amateur gymnast, if you will. At the same time, she suffered from manic depression very, very severely. And when Adler was 10 years old, she was institutionalized. And his father could not take care of him. He loved Gunther, and it was their only child. But he was a man very immersed in his business. He just didn't know what to do. He had sisters, aunts who Adler loved very much, but they too didn't have the means or the time to take care of him. So he was sent to foster homes, first in eastern Czechoslovakia, small town with a family that he loved very much, and then southern Czechoslovakia with another family that he cared for a great deal. And that's the family we see in Panorama, the Herr Neumann, who runs the store, is very much the family that Adler was a foster child with in southern Czechoslovakia, right on the Austrian border. And then he was sent to a Freemasons Institute in Dresden, Germany, which he described as his first concentration camp. He was badly bullied as a Czech Jew, both as a Czech and a Jew, in Dresden. And at the age of 15, pleaded with his father to come back to Prague. The deal being that he started back at high school, but he was older. He was behind the other students. He felt out of place with them. So he made a deal with his father that if he studied independently for his high school finishing exams, he would not have to attend high school. He did just that, passing all of his exams in math, science, history, music as well, and then entered the university and studied musicology, wrote a dissertation on Klopstock und die Musik, and that's the great 17th century German poet Johannes Klopstock, a Baroque poet, but particularly looking at the themes of music throughout Klopstock's poetry. He was a trained musician himself, played piano, also composed music, composed several sonatas and song cycles as a young man. All of these, unfortunately, were later lost. So he's very much a worldly, Middle European autodidact. After he graduates from university, he takes a position at the Urania Cultural Center in Prague, which still exists, by the way. And he was basically the secretary or the managing director. He organized lectures. Thomas Mann came there to lecture. Many prominent worldly figures. This would be something close, very close to the 92nd Street Y in New York City. Very much that kind of programming where you have very prominent cultural figures coming to speak. And that was going to be, he worked there for 2 or 3 years. That was going to be the kind of career. He began writing at that stage. He was writing short stories. But of course, things begin to change in 1933 and certainly by 1938. And he, in 1938, on actually New Year's Eve of 1938, he meets a young woman named Gertrude Klepeta, who is very independent, very athletic. She was a marksman and an expert at archery. She was also a trained scientist, a chemist, and he fell in love with her immediately. And she had parents in Prague, and as things began to take a turn for the worse, they both, of course, lost their positions. And deportations, talk of deportations, and the Jewish suppressive laws in Prague began to take effect. There was no work. Adler goes to Italy to try to train to sell industrial abrasives in Brazil, but he could not afford the visa or the travel ticket to get to Brazil. He tries to get out, but ultimately he's not able to secure a visa through his friends Franz Bernsteiner and Elias Canetti in London, who they were boyhood friends and whom he had. Franz Bernsteiner was a boyhood friend. Canetti he had been friends with since 1936, after having hosted a lecture by Canetti, a reading by Canetti from his first novel at the Urania. But he never secured a visa, goes to Italy with the hopes of getting to Brazil. That doesn't happen. And finally, what really happens is that he is so committed to Gertrude and she refuses to leave that they decide to marry, hoping that if they are to be deported or whatever fate is going to happen to them, at least they could do so together. Indeed, he and she and her parents are deported to Theresienstadt on February 8th, 1942. Adler's, well, I'll leave this. His future wife, Bettina Gross, her mother was deported to Theresienstadt in December of 1941. Here's a drawing of Adler in Theresienstadt in 1943 by Peter Keen, who of course can see the thinness of his neck and his whole body. Peter Keen wrote the libretto for the Emperor of Atlantis, the opera that was written in Theresienstadt itself. So again, Adler circulated among the musicians, among the artists, among the writers in Theresienstadt. However, he was not a prominente. He was not a member of the prominent Jews in Theresienstadt. He befriended Leo Baeck. In fact, Leo Baeck writes a brief preface to the Theresienstadt book that was published in 1955. In fact, really, Leo Baeck wrote that preface pretty much on his deathbed. He had had a bad accident. He was in severe shape in the hospital, but nonetheless proceeded to complete the preface and submit it to Adler for the publication of the book. So Adler was quite well known in Theresienstadt, and he would have been known through Gertrude, because Gertrude headed the laboratory in Theresienstadt and was responsible for saving many Jews. She had the ability to declare Jews too ill to work, too ill to be deported. She did a lot of experimentation with tuberculosis and diagnosis of tuberculosis. So she actually ends up saving Adler in Theresienstadt, because she is so prominent that she stays for 2.5 years. She and Adler were deported to Auschwitz in October 14th, 1944. The deportations to the east ended on November 1st, 1944. So in fact, that only 2 weeks before the ceasing of the deportations is when Gertrude and Gunther were deported to Auschwitz. When they get to Auschwitz, and they're deported along with Gertrude's mother. Her father died in Theresienstadt in 1943. So to Auschwitz go Gertrude, Gunther, and her father, Leopold. And on the ramp, her mother, Elizabeth, on the ramp in Auschwitz, Gertrude, her mother, is, as an elderly person, is selected out, is not considered to be work worthy, and is carted off to the gas chamber. Gertrude cannot bear to be separated from her mother, and leaves Gunther on the ramp in Auschwitz, sort of half smiles to him and walks away with her mother, and Gunther never sees her again. He spends 2 weeks. All in all, they had spent 32 months in Theresienstadt. And then Gunther was in Auschwitz for 2 weeks before being transferred to a small armaments camp called Niederroschel, where they built airplane parts and assembled airplane wings. Though interestingly enough, not a single wing ever made it to the sky. They sabotaged all the wings. So there were stacks and stacks of sabotaged wings that were never ever actually utilized in German planes. He's there for about 3.5 months, and then transferred to Langenstein, which we see in Panorama itself. And Langenstein, in many ways, he considered the worst place. It was an underground armaments factory. It was set up in a salt mine, extremely harsh, extremely cold conditions. He's liberated by the Americans in mid-April of 1945, but said another 3 weeks and he would have been dead. His condition had deteriorated so far. He leaves Langenstein and basically walks back to Prague. It takes him 6 weeks to get back to Prague, nearly dead. When he gets to Prague, he discovers he has lost 18 family members to the Holocaust, including his father, his stepmother, his mother herself. In fact, it's quite a poignant story of his mother. She was transported to Theresienstadt from a mental hospital in 1943 or 44, I think it's 43. And he does not dare go see her because he was afraid that in being associated with her, that the stigma of mental illness could be passed to him by the Germans, and that he would be vulnerable, and Gertrude as well, be expendable then. So his mother is in Theresienstadt for 6 weeks in the mental hospital in Theresienstadt. He never sees her, and then she's deported to the east and killed. Adler gets back to Prague in June of 1945, writes immediately to his friend Franz Bermansteiner in Oxford. And then after a few months, he's able to secure the address of a woman named Bettina Gross. This is a photo of her in 1938. She was a high school friend. They were not romantically involved. They were just very good friends. And he had told her to get out of Czechoslovakia. And so she had spent the war in Great Britain and in South Wales, working as a graphic designer in a button factory. She found his address. He found her address. And in October, November of 1945, they write to each other, and their first letters to each other cross in the mail. He writes to her, and she is simultaneously writing to him. After that, a feverish 6 weeks of letters, sometimes 2 letters a day, passes between them. And he, after 6 weeks, proposes marriage to her by mail. And in fact, he actually doesn't propose to her. He writes to her and says, now that we will be married. And Bettina writes back and says, Gunther, what have you done? You didn't even ask me. And then she accepts the marriage, even before really questioning it at all. Her mother had been with Gunther in Theresienstadt, and he had taken care of her mother. And she very much felt that this was, if you will, almost a charge, a duty to those who had been lost, to marry Gunther, help him get out of Czechoslovakia. And it takes 18 months to get a visa. And finally, in February of 1947, he arrives in London. They go immediately to Wales and are married in Merthyr Tydfil, an industrial town in southern Wales, and then move to London, where he proceeds to work on his novels and the Theresienstadt book. This is him in 1955, just before the publication of the Theresienstadt book. This is outside their flat in London. You can see by the paint chipping off the door, and again his rather thin condition. These were very, very hard times for her, for Gunther and Bettina. Their son Jeremy was born in 1948, I believe it is. So they had a very small child to raise. Gunther refused to take any kind of menial job. People had suggested he become a wine waiter or work as a gardener, but he dedicated himself entirely to his scholarly work on the Theresienstadt book, to his poetry, and to his novels during this period. I calculated it up between 1947 and 1955. Adler wrote something like 10,000 manuscript pages of literature and scholarship, which is a rate of almost a 1,000 pages a month, or it's like, you can break it down to like 3 pages a day, which is an extraordinary amount of writing for any writer, day after day after day. He had completed a draft of the Theresienstadt book in 1949, but it took him many, many publishers, many, many tries finally for it to be brought out. It was well received. He gained a fair measure of world fame from it, and then hoped to publish his novels, but that never happened. A second novel that he completed, called The Journey, Eine Reise, which was completed in 1951. He had submitted it to Zollkamp publishers, and Peter Zollkamp, who himself had been interred at Sachsenhausen outside of Berlin, said, as long as I am alive, this novel will not appear in Germany. And it did not. Zollkamp dies in 1961. The novel appears in 1962 from a very tiny publisher, which couldn't really sustain it and support it. There were a few reviews, but it basically disappears. Like I said, it took another 20 years for Panorama to appear, and The Wall did not appear until a year after Adler's death. There are 4 more novels which exist in his archive. And have not been yet published. He wrote 180 short stories, 90 of which appeared in publication, 90 of which were never published. His collected poems, I actually have them right here, Andere Wege, Other Ways, runs to 1,200 pages and was not published until 2010, really after Adler's, a revival of interest started in Adler. I'm going down, I wonder if I can quickly pull up. No, I know what it is. No, I'm going to shrink that. And if I shrink this, just a few more. There's that picture there's another photo of Gertrude. This is a drawing of her in Theresienstadt at the same time. And then let me skip ahead. This is actually bring this up too. This is the briefcase that Adler walked out of. When he left Theresienstadt for Auschwitz, he left all of his papers with Leo Baeck. While he was working in Theresienstadt, he began to gather administrative documents, which mainly passed through Gertrude's hands because she was a prominent doctor in the camp. And he told himself in Theresienstadt 6 weeks after he got there, if I survive this, I will record it in two ways, in writing and in scholarship. And by writing, he meant by creative writing. He writes 108 poems in Theresienstadt, many of which were love poems, poems about nature, poems about God. He writes several short stories. He begins a novel, which he later completes in draft after the war. And he starts collecting papers and writing essays, which turn into his Theresienstadt book. He leaves all of this with Leo Baeck in this briefcase when he's deported to Auschwitz, not knowing if he's ever going to return. When he gets back to Prague in June of 1945, he immediately goes to Theresienstadt, which is about an hour and a half northwest of Prague, and goes back, and Leo Baeck is still there, and collects this briefcase from Leo Baeck in June of 1945. And as I say, basically walks out of that camp with the next 40 years of his life in this briefcase, because out of this comes the novels, out of this comes the Theresienstadt book, out of this comes eventually his 1,200-page book on all of the deportation system itself. Let's see if there's something else to show. There's Bettina again. These are the daily diaries that Adler kept, and this is from 1952. It's the next to last entry between 1952 and 1955, when he was at his most destitute. And what this says in German is, "Was ist geistige Arbeit?" What is intellectual work? Adler could not find a way to employ his intellect for monetary gain. So all he could do was to continue to write his scholarship and his novels. This is him in 1957. After the publication of Theresienstadt, you can see the change that's come over him. He's gained weight. He's well dressed. He begins to return to Europe and to lecture about the Holocaust and the camps in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Becomes quite a renowned figure in lecture circuits at Jewish community centers, particularly, and also continues to do research for his future book on all of the deportations. I will skip that for now. This is just my favorite photo of Adler. He dies in London in 1988, having published 26 books of poetry, fiction, novels, scholarship, but largely remaining almost entirely unknown by the German reading public. Here he is at an opening for Holocaust art at the Manchester Museum in Manchester, England. And he's reviewing the catalog. Much of this art he had carried out himself from Theresienstadt after the war, when he worked for the Prague Jewish Museum. He felt it was very important to maintain this and document it. I love this picture. Here he is, towards the end of his life. He dies in 1988 of heart ailments, basically. And he's calmly reviewing the material. Did they get it right? What is to be learned here? He has found a way through this material and found a way to live a life of worth and nobility in the face of the loss that he and so many others had endured. I think I'll end it there, and then, Michael, does that make sense?
Yes, that would be fine. We can begin the discussion. Thanks. And actually, Peter, we had a few questions already that are biographical in nature. One is, did Adler testify at Nuremberg?
No, he did not. At that stage, he was not yet, he hadn't published the Theresienstadt book. He did hope to testify at the Eichmann trial in 1961. He wrote a 47-page affidavit showing how Eichmann knew what he was doing, and particularly looking at the language that Eichmann used to couch his activities in. That was the picture I was going to show of a young man named Yehuda Bakon, who was taken in by Adler after the war in Prague. He was a young artist, Israeli artist. In fact, this is a very prominent Israeli artist, is still alive today. In fact, on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, Yehuda Bakan's picture was on the cover of Der Spiegel as the sort of quintessential survivor of that experience. Bakan did testify at the trial of Eichmann because he had, as a very young boy, been part of the Rollwagen Kommando. It was the boys assigned with wagons to transport ashes from the gas chambers to the icy paths of Auschwitz, or in the summer to the fields or to the river running by Auschwitz. When it was particularly cold, the guards would take pity on the boys and allow them inside to stand inside the gas chamber to get out of the cold and the wind. So Bakan actually knew the workings, the interior workings of the chamber, and testified at Eichmann's trial. That's why in Panorama, we have the accounts of the victims dying inside the gas chamber, something that is relatively taboo in Holocaust literature, because how can you, as a survivor, write about the experience of the inside of the gas chambers? Adler felt he could do this. In fact, there are letters. He writes to Bakan. They're very, very close. And he says, what happened? Tell me. He wants to know every single detail of Bakan's experience, and he transforms that into the experience of Josef Kramer, his imagination into the gas chambers in Panorama.